Thanks, Dennis. What I'd like to do is just to focus a little bit on something that we presented back on February 6th on this show, just to establish something, and then look at two executive orders that have been issued by the Biden administration. 13990, for which there is a growing opposition, which is very healthy, led by a lawsuit that was brought by the Attorney General of Missouri, Eric Schmidt. And one that's less known, but actually is extremely important, 14008. And we'll look at that. And then something called Making Mission Happen, which is a blueprint for pulling down those critical features of a physical economy without which you cannot have a physical economy. And it's run by something called the Energy Transition Commission. And therefore, look at what that means for what we're doing. And just to emphasize, what you could call the clock, if you want, on this Green New Deal is running very, very quickly. We're much more advanced than I think some would see, and it's important that we take stock of where we really are. So if I could have the first slide, please. So this is Prince Charles. He's been in the news recently, and I know Mike Robinson's going to speak about him. But the thing that I would want to emphasize is that he has a power which is not his, but it's part of an institutional arrangement between the monarchy, the City of London, and Wall Street, clearly, and some other financial centers, the Bank of England, and the MI5, MI6, GCHQ, the intelligence services, and others. I'm not saying they're the only one, but I would say they're probably the core institution for what we refer to as the British Empire. And he has, for 45 years, been directing the formation of what we call the Great Reset, the Green New Deal. Again, he's not the only person, but this is a power center that has an institutional memory and has quite a bit of force behind it. Next one, please. And these are three people who we identified a few weeks ago, but just to state again, on the there's Prince Philip, and then in the middle, Prince Bernhard, and then there's Julian Huxley. And they're all extremely important. Prince Philip is the Prince Consort and Charles's father. They decided to use the World Wildlife Fund as a central base of operation for this principle of the British Empire, of the oligarchical model of Babylon. And I'm not saying there aren't others that are very important, like the International Union of Conservation of Nature and so forth. But this was one that they used. And let's just see a bit, again, of what their thinking is. So next one, please. So my screen covers up a little bit of this, but it talks about the genetic stupidity. This is Huxley. Physical weakness, disease proneness, which already exists in this population. My screen covers out a little bit, so I can't read every word. I apologize. Will prove too great a burden for real progress to be achieved. This is Huxley arguing for the return to eugenics. 1 year after the Second World War is ended, and people can tell you there's rubble all throughout Italy, there's rubble throughout Germany. So the reminder of what this 1933-45 experiment was trying to do for population control, but also extermination of peoples, is very alive. But to continue his statement, thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be for UNESCO, which Huxley had formed, become the head of, to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care, and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable. Next, please. And this is a statement from Prince Philip. I wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated, and again, my screen is placed in a certain way, as an animal whose species has been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would its feelings towards the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus. And this is his foreword in the book. And that was written in 1987, If I Were an Animal. He didn't write the book, he wrote the foreword. So what these people did, just in very short order, is that Charles was deployed to the 1992 conference, which was called the Rio Earth Summit. Two features of that: he was one of the people who led that process, having a meeting the year before 1991 on his yacht, Britannia. And just two things, at that conference, among many, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the ones that keep telling us we have global warming, had included man-made and natural causes of global warming. And whatever you want to characterize as global warming in the natural by far outweighs whatever the man-made is. But from that point forward at this conference, they then decided that it was just going to refer to what man-made global warming was and drop the other part, which is the predominant. And the second feature of this is they set up a United Nations framework on climate, convention on climate. And this is what started to put into place the various greenhouse gases and the restrictions that should be put on them. That was finalized in 1997 at the Kyoto conference 5 years later. This was 1992. And those are the ones that we're dealing with today. I would say that this conference was filled with a outlook of literally taking down civilization. And every 5 years, you have another conference that's based on this framework, which was then established. The other point I would make, next, please. Yes, that's the Rio Earth Summit. That was event. It was over 100 leaders of nations and 38,000 people. Next, please. And this is the Green New Deal. And the only thing I'll say here, and you can read this in our report, so I don't want to repeat, but the Green New Deal was formed in 2008 by Prince Charles and by two of his closest little green men, as I call them, Charles Port and Tony Juniper. And then it was set up in such a way that it could be exported to the United States. So it wasn't started by Ed Markey, it wasn't started by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, nor Bernie Sanders. It was started by Charles. Okay, now this is Executive Order 13990, and its title is Executive Order on Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. This was issued, President Biden became president, was sworn in the afternoon of the 20th of January. This was issued about a few hours later. So this clearly wasn't drawn up on January 20th. It was drawn up most likely during the summer preceding of last year, the summer of 2020. Could have been drawn up 2 years ago. It was something that was drawn up by this crowd that I've identified, and you can include many of the larger and more important banks and speculators and BlackRock and so forth that were involved in this process. It was drawn up with the expectation that it could then start to be implemented very directly. Next, please. I'm going to say something in a second about what is in this. But the good news is that on March 8th, just a few days ago, a suit was brought against this executive order, Biden's Executive Order 13990. And this suit, which was brought by Eric Schmidt and the 11 other attorney generals from states like Iowa and South Dakota, many of the farm states in particular, says that this will inflict trillions of dollars of damage to the U.S. economy for decades to come. It will destroy jobs, stifle energy production, strangle America's energy independence, suppress agriculture, deter innovation, and impoverish working families. And then further, the suit charges that as a result of the implementation of this 13990 executive order, that the U.S. agricultural and energy production, which these actions, which means Biden's executive order, would stifle, have global benefits, which enrich the entire world. And yet the Biden administration gave them little or no weight in its calculation of the social cost of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide. This was filed in the Eastern District of Missouri, as I said, on March 8th. And then afterwards, Schmidt tweeted that Biden's executive order, quote, is a Trojan horse for the Green New Deal. Today we led a coalition to stop it. Missouri is fighting back. And Arkansas has just joined, so that makes 13 states. Now, what is he talking about that's at the heart of this? Well, it's something called if we could go to the next slide, please. It's called social cost of carbon. And this is the way it works. This is from a report on this, the social cost of carbon, the social cost of methane, the social cost of nitrous oxide, and so forth. They use cost-benefit analysis in most government agencies to figure out whether you build something. It's not a smart policy because oftentimes if something is an infrastructure project that has 30 years to be developed, which Alexander Hamilton would have built, which Abraham Lincoln would have built, which Roosevelt would have built, they will say, no, we need returns within the next 2 to 3 years. That doesn't guarantee it. Let's build a baseball stadium or something else instead. But the way this works is the following. They assign the social cost, which we'll see in a second, an alleged social cost, of how much damage can be done by, say, CO2. And if you found that you're pricing CO2 at $50, this is an artificial concept. It's not what you walk into a store and buy CO2. You don't buy it anyway, but it's not that. And you figure out how many tons of CO2, like a power plant or a bridge that use coal processes like cement and steel that were made using energy from a power plant, then you add those costs as a cost, not just your bricks, not just your mortar, not just your piping, but now this is a cost against global warming. It's a cost because of climate change, rising rivers, shorelines, heat that would burn you up alive. These are all the alleged consequences of global warming, which itself does not exist in any way that is being portrayed. And certainly man's contribution to whatever is going on is negligible. Most of this is cosmic rays, solar rays, and other processes which have been going on for at least a billion years that we know of, and there are historical records on this. But if we can go back to the diagram, so that's added as a cost, and therefore governments are told, well, this is far too costly. In addition to whatever the prejudice was against infrastructure, now you have laden onto that an additional cost because you're damaging future society. However, if you have something that will decrease emissions, like allegedly, like for example, wind turbines or solar panels or things of that sort, and we saw how well they did in Texas, literally breaking down completely in the part of February and overloading the system by having to use natural gas and other things to make up the shortage from their breakdown, which could not be done in a way which would avoid blackouts. But if you do that, why, that's a benefit. So therefore, this is a benefit that you get by building those because you're reducing pollution. So naturally, and here's the story, all state governments, all federal agencies, local governments are going to be instructed to use this as an accounting system across the United States. And there will be an attempt to make this applied against also companies that are in this setting. But the thing is, think about this for a second. Let's say you want to build a power station or a flood control, but you're told, well, this is going to happen in Arkansas where they build a lot of rice. You don't need that because that produces a lot of nitrous oxide. So don't build it. In fact, anything that will benefit agriculture will be scarred with the concept that if you build any federal or state project for that area, you are adding social costs of carbon or nitrous oxide and so forth. Next, please. Now, I just want to give people a sense of this because it's a little bit of a different concept, but it's clear enough that some people recognize what it means. Mr. Schmidt's statement in that lawsuit is very strong, and he sees this. So here's what the social costs are. They say that if you use 1 ton additional of carbon, that will cause such damage to the climate that will cost $50 to $100 extra for any project. If you use 1 extra ton of methane, which everybody knows cows and various animals produce when they fart, excuse me, French, that will cost $1,500 extra per ton. If you produce nitrous oxide, that will add $18,000 of per ton to what you have to market coal as your cost. Now, two things about this. Below that, I just want to show you the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere is absolutely minuscule, and there is no proof that has ever scientifically that they cause what they're claimed to be causing. Take nitrous oxide. It is 0.00003%. That is, it's 3/100,000ths of a percent. It's not a percent. It's not a tenth of a percent. It's not a thousandth of a percent. It's 3/100,000ths of a percent of the entire gases that we have in the atmosphere. Yet it's supposed to produce various things. One of which is it was supposed to deplete the ozone hole. Scientific America just reported that the Antarctic ozone hole is the smallest it's been since 1988. So that's obviously not the case. It's also supposed to produce acid rain. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, tells you that that basically was solved, whether it did it or not, in the 1990s. So, but nonetheless, what's important is that even though most of the nitrous oxide that's produced in agriculture, 60% of it comes from nature, 40% comes from man, from methane, and of course from fertilizer that's used in the soil to make it able to produce a huge amount of food of healthy quality with a fraction of the labor it took us when we were back in 1776 forming this country. So therefore, agriculture will be penalized by having to add $18,000 for every ton of nitrous oxide that's produced, even though that's only 40% of all nitrous oxide, and even though the United States has reduced its nitrous oxide production by over 70% since 1985. All that said, it doesn't exist as a real problem. It's not scientifically proven to cause anything that we know of any significance. It does cause some things. It is so small in the atmosphere, it's ridiculous, but this is what's being put through. And so therefore, all the agricultural states figured this out, as did others as well, as people will figure this out as we go forward. And that is at the heart of 13990. It's an attack on agriculture. It's saying that we are going to go back to a more primitive form of agriculture, and we are going to start eliminating agricultural production on a very, very large scale and go to what is called the Lancet diet, which eliminates meat and other things. Next, please. Okay, now this is Executive Order 14008, and this was issued on January 27th, so it's 1 week after President Biden became president. And you may remember for about the first 10 to 14 days, most people did not see President Biden. He was sitting and writing, signing these executive orders at the White House. This was just streaming these out one after another. Now, this one has two features which I think are extraordinarily important, and I'll just mention them. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for that file folder. This order is far more insidious than people really realize. Let me just say what it's going to do. It's going to it directs the National Intelligence, that is the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to report on the security implications of climate change. So it's now shifting climate change into a central policy in every agency, including, of course, our Defense Department and the intelligence services. But it does more than that. It establishes the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, which is going to have a conference very soon on these very issues, where every governmental agency will take into account the impact of climate and greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to be working on what can be procured, which we just saw in the previous example, which were called the social cost of carbon, the social cost of methane, and the social cost of nitrous oxide. It calls for doubling wind production by 2030. It calls for a federal moratorium on oil and gas development that will be paused on public lands. It calls for elimination of any subsidies or inducements to these areas. It wants to set up a civilian climate corps. Roosevelt set up a civilian conservation corps. We've called for a civilian space corps, which looks to the stars, looks to developing mankind. It's going to set up an environmental justice agency. But another feature of this, just to continue on the agricultural theme, it has a policy called 30 by 30 conservation, which says that we will have to remove 30% of federal lands and 30% of waters from any form of energy development or use for those types of productive purposes. Well, 12% of American land has now been removed in various places. This would take more than double. It would take 2.5 times what we have out of being used for agriculture and other processes. It will do the same for water. And so it's called triple 30. 30% of land would be taken out of use, 30% of water would be taken out of use, and all the marine life and so forth that flows therefrom. Of course, offshore drilling would be nailed on this stuff. You can forget the fossil fuel industry. And it will all be done by 2030. And Marcia Mary Baker writes about this in our report, The Great Step Backward, and points out that what's happening on this is being led in one part by the European Union, which has a program called From Farm to Fork. And that program calls for, and I just would like to cite one feature of that so people get a sense of where they're going. The U.S. Department of Agriculture analyzed the farm to fork policy of the European Union because it's what Biden has in mind for the United States. And that said, according to our U.S. Department of Agriculture, which analyzed it, that in the report, land and agriculture would be cut by 10%, fertilizer use by 20%, pesticide use by 50%, antimicrobials, which are antibiotics which are fed for livestock, would be cut by 50%. So this means you're wiping this out. This is what this is a step for. And the fact that it's putting climate change at the center of strategic policy in every department of the United States, including our military, tells you that this is a profound shift. This is not just an addition or onto one thing or another. It's simply a change in what the direction of the United States is going to be doing. Almost none of this was publicized during the campaign. You didn't hear about these things, but they're being rolled out right now. And this is the core of the Green New Deal, which you heard about from Julian Huxley. Next, please. Okay, this is the last thing I want to feature. This is called Making Mission Possible. And you can see that's the cover of about an 80-page report. And it's called the Energy Transitions Commission. The key person here is a guy named Lord Nicholas Stern. Stern put out a report around 2006, 2007, which called for a complete change of the world based on reducing CO2 emissions and decarbonization. Prince Charles praised that in 2006, pushed this in 2008, and then he and Prince Charles got together in 2015, where they were both together, they were photographed together, to help develop in Paris in November of that year what's called COP21, which is the Paris Accord, which President Biden just took us back into, which is a hideous accord. So he is definitely in the circles of Prince Charles. There's many other sides to this. Next, please. Thank you. Now, what they do is they target hard to abate industries in this report. And they target aluminum, steel, cement. They also target plastics and other things. And what they say is that these, and this whole report, by the way, is based on the fact that by 2040, the world, according to the International Energy Agency, would have about 567 trillion joules of energy supply. And they cite an alternative which would reduce that by 30%, down to 398 trillion joules. What does that mean? They're called exajoules. What does that mean? It means that they want a level far below where it should go, touched by natural growth. If we were to develop Africa, if we were to develop America, if we were to start building the nuclear power plants, the fission processes, way expanding our missions to Mars, if we were to do those things, we would be far beyond even what a moderate rate of growth would be. They actually have a level for 2040, which is below where it is right now. So if you have any doubts about where energy is going, this should dispel it. So they tackle aluminum, steel, and cement, saying it's very hard for them to reduce these uses of carbon. So we're going to work on that, but they have to reduce the carbon. Well, they don't have any solutions. So you can figure out what's going to happen. These are going to be wiped out. Now, I want to just show you what the uses of aluminum, steel, and cement are. We've dealt with agriculture. I want you to see what's going to happen in industry. Okay, aluminum, power lines, high-rise buildings, aircraft components, spacecraft components, ships, trains, bridges, personal vehicles, and of course, all the household appliances you know of. This is critical, but aluminum uses a lot of electricity, and they're going to tell you that that electricity either emits CO2 or N2O, which is nitrous oxide, or various other things like that, so you can't have it. Next, please. This is cement. Well, think about it. What do you see cement in? Roads, dams, bridges, tunnels, culverts, shipping ports, airports, water pipe type floors, precast pipe for manufacturing, all infrastructure. Every single feature of infrastructure in the United States and in the world comes from the use of cement, which we'll get to in a second. And last, next, please. Steel. What does that go into? Roads, dams, bridges, tunnels, culverts, machine tools, stamping and forging machines, electric generators, turbines, transformers, tractors, reapers, harvesters, office buildings, railroads, locomotives, and all throughout your residential homes. Now, what is this then? Why are they calling for this to effectively be shut down? They're just saying we want to reduce the energy, but if they can't get rid of their CO2, that's not acceptable. So that means we're getting rid of this. If an economy, take LaRouche's concept of an economy. An economy is an integrated feature. It's not where we build a little something here, we throw up a hut there. You have different processes which are necessary as a whole to raise mankind's relative potential population density, which means especially increasing the cognitive potential of man and making breakthroughs to next levels of development. If you took those three elements by themselves out, you could not build infrastructure, you would not have manufacturing, you would not have agricultural implements. And if you take away the land, what do you have? You have the complete takedown of the agro-manufacturing republic, which was created in America as an expression, as Lynn said earlier, of Louis XI and Henry VII and so forth. This is what the plan is. It's the plan that Julian Huxley was talking about. And the feature is that, just to put it positively, and then you can see what the negative is. When you go from wood burning to coal and the fossil fuels, oil, gas, you go up 2 orders of magnitude in energy flux density. When you go from coal and so forth up to nuclear fission and fusion, you're going up 10 to the 5th power in joules per gram, energy flux density. When you do that, you don't just change one feature or another feature. You change the entirety of how that economy works as a process and its embedded potential for even greater anti-entropic growth. What this plan is to go the opposite way, to take you down by taking out steel, by taking out aluminum, by taking out everything that's vital for existence, and make impossible any future generation. And they're saying we're not even going to have as much energy in 20 years as we have today. Now, the point about this is that this is what we're looking into. If you combine this with the biggest financial blowout in 400 years, if you combine this with a threat to push for nuclear war by those British forces that see the only way that they may be able to stop China and Russia is to ignite a war which would take down most of the world, which they believe, as long as we can survive it one way or another, will rebuild. So if you take those two elements of insanity and this policy, which I've just shown, you won't have existence. Next, please. Okay. If you take out 30%, and there's a guy named Woolley who wants to take out 50% of the land, we're going back to what Africa was. Now, this is Africa in 1994. So this is expanded. But if you see those little patches, those are wildlife reserves, where, by the way, many things went on which were not to protect animals at all. And you can see that you have entire portions of Africa where you could not build something because of those reserves. Now, those have since expanded in size greatly under the World Wildlife Fund, Prince Philip, and others. But now think of America having 30 to 50% of those reserves. This is the colonialization of America. This is how the oligarchy lives. Next, please. Now, what's actually going on? And this is a strategic bombing survey. You keep hearing environmental this and environmental that. I mentioned briefly that nitrous oxide is not causing acid rain, and even if it had in the beginning, it's now stated that that's not an issue, nor is it opening an ozone hole over the Antarctic. And people who are pushing this policy know that. They don't care. When, during World War II, and this is true for every nation, you set up an Office of Economic Warfare. And the Office of Economic Warfare looks at a country that it wants to fight, or doesn't want to necessarily, but is in a war with, like us with Nazi Germany. And you had to figure out, if I wanted to knock them out, I just don't drop bombs on citizens unendingly. What you do is you figure out, where are their power plants? Where are their dams? Where are their water supplies? Where are their electricity supplies? Where do they make aluminum, which is critical for aircraft? Where do they make other things which are essential for food? Ball bearings seems like a small thing, critical for industry. Machine tools, critical for industry. And you bomb it. You simply take it out of existence. And you lessen the ability of the enemy to fight. That's what's being done here in the United States. It's a strategic bombing survey. This is taken of Osaka, which was not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so it wasn't hit by the nuclear bombs, but we were bombing it. And you can see all the little marks. They're analyzing what they did the next day of how effective this was. This has zero to do with the environment. And the last thing I just want to say is, the way this was put together for the last 75 years is, what do we have to knock out? This is the thinking of the oligarchs. This is the thinking, of John Schellenhuber. This is the thinking of Prince Charles. What do we have to knock out? And then we'll invent an excuse afterwards. Acid rain, throw it in afterwards. But you first select the targets that you want to knock out, like certain politicians who you want to knock out, and then you invent the scandal afterwards. This is happening far faster. I will just say, in terms of coal-fired plants, we have shut down, the United States has had shut down 229 over the last decade, and we only have 241 left. And we've gone from 2 gigawatts to 1 gigawatt of coal-fired plant electricity. This is before Biden came in. So we have a tremendous job. The fighting spirit of some of the attorney generals is very inspiring, but we have to reach everyone. And we can't assume that this is just a design, the Green New Deal, the Great Reset. It's terrible, but it's off in the future. Another year, another 2 years, and it's going to get bad. No, it is being implemented. This farm to fork policy, the EU is going to come back with a policy statement in 45 days. That's it, a month and a half. Many of these things are being done in a month and a half or 2. They're not even open for public criticism yet, which is amazing. We're being ruled by executive decrees, essentially. And I would urge people to show up next week and bring at least one friend or 2 to our conference to get this report that we've produced and get it out to people, get it to different people. We've got loads of congressmen and others that we want to, and diplomats and so forth, that we need to get this to. And this is that fight that can win. We can absolutely win this, but those are the terms of it.